Today is the 18th of April, 2014. My name is Martin Donacimento, and I'm here interviewing Ramon or Ray Chavez for the AEJMC Diversity Oral History Interview Project. That's a mouthful. Thank you, Ray or Ramon. Which do you prefer
Most
to go
people
by?
know me as Ray.
Okay, well, thank you, Ray, for taking the time to sit with us and put up with all of
Sure.
our
Problem.
questions and
No
such.
problem at all.
Please know that it will be housed at the AEG. The interview will be housed at the AEJMC archives at Columbia, South Carolina, and here at the Briscoe Center at UT.
Oh, okay. Good.
And we'll also post the interview on the internet. And then we've got a form to fill out after the fact.
Okay. Sounds good.
Alrighty. Okay, well, yeah, let's just jump right in. The first questions are just kind of about your early years and how you got into journalism and that kind of stuff. So can I ask how it was that you became interested in journalism? If you had role models or
Not. I got into journalism by accident, just set of circumstances. Because the high school I went to in El Paso, Texas, El Paso Technical High School, was part vocational trade school and then part regular high school. You got a diploma, not a GED. So while I was there, I had to pick a shop, and I chose architectural drafting because I thought that would be something that could get me a job right away. And upon graduation, I didn't really have plans to go to college, at least not right away, because the family income was such that probably not possible. So what I did was I took the architectural drafting, and then I did take a journalism class, but did very little writing. I was assigned to be the business manager for the school newspaper. So I mostly did bookkeeping. I thought that was another interesting skill. And I did write some copy for the yearbook, but I didn't get hooked on journalism or even thought of it as a career. But fortunately for us, our athletic teams, we were allowed to have athletic teams at this technical school and compete against all the other regular high schools in the city and in the state. And I ended up, because of my grandmother's Tarahumara blood, I was a pretty good distance runner. And our team not only won the city championship and the district championship, we went on to win the state championship in Texas. And so all of a sudden I'm getting all these scholarship offers. Not for my head, not for my brains, but for my legs. And that's how I ended up at Texas Tech University in Lubbock on a full ride track scholarship. And I had to decide on a major. So I chose architecture. And my first semester there was almost a disaster because I could not do the math. At my technical trade school, we didn't emphasize collegiate level courses, and so the math skills were poor. And so I was in danger of losing my scholarship because my GPA was dipping, and so I went to a counselor, and she asked me what I enjoyed doing, and I said, well, I enjoy writing, and I had done well in learning English and wrote better than most of my classmates. And she says, what else do you like? I said, I like sports. She says, well, let's combine the two. And I said, okay, sports writing, sports writing. I said, sign me up for that. And she said, well, we don't call it that, we call it journalism. I said, why don't we try that for a while and see if you like it. And so that's how I stumbled into it, more on a survival mode to keep my track scholarship and try to do something that I had perhaps some talent for. And so I switched to journalism, and the rest is history because I really got hooked on it. And the reality is I never really did that much sports writing. It was once I got into journalism and found out what it was all about, then that's what I ended up doing.
Sure. There's one little alteration that I want to make before I go on.
Okay.
That's an incredible story.
Oh,
Is
the
there any way
fan.
to just stop it from
Yeah,
spinning?
let me see.
Okay,
So I don't pull
thank
this.
you.
I forgot about this. Got a little bit of a hum. Oops. There you go.
Okay, yeah, that's perfect. And it's not even the sound. It actually, I'm pretty sure it's not picking it up in here, but you never can tell exactly. Yeah, just the light going off the ceiling and then back.
Right, I should have anticipated that. Yeah.
What were the classes that you liked the most, or the within the journalism program?
I really enjoyed the writing classes because that's where I excelled. And again, thanks to my brother. I had a brother who was 4 years older than me, and he was the one who had become my English teacher because my parents spoke some English, but it was very broken English. And my grandparents grew up in the same household. They spoke only Spanish. So I spoke Spanish before I even went to grade school. And my brother became my English teacher. So that's why I enjoyed the English classes, the news writing classes, reporting, editing, those kind of working with words. I took some other courses. I liked the photography class because it provided a creative outlet for me. But what really got me hooked was working on the school newspaper. Once I got on the staff there, I really enjoyed going out and doing stories, and then, I kind of liked the pressure of deadline. I found that I could write stories quickly on deadline and do that sort of thing. So those are the courses and the activities at Texas Tech that I most enjoyed.
Can you describe a little bit more about the newspaper to me? Like, what did it look like? Who else was there? What stories would you work on?
Sure. I'm told, and I've tried to research it, and have not found any other Spanish surnamed students who were on the school newspaper. The Texas Tech University Daily is what it was called at the time. And so I believe I was the first Latino to be on the news staff at the University Daily at Tech. And I found that interesting because I knew that there were others who had the talent and the skills to succeed in that, but I looked around me in my newsroom and I discovered that, I was the only Latino and there weren't any in the pipeline. So that was an interesting experience. I was treated well by the staff and by the student editor. I tried to generate some stories. At that time, most of the stories about minorities were about East Lubbock, which is the area where most of the African Americans lived. So I wrote more of the minority-related stories were about African Americans, which was a new experience for me as well. And not much about the Latinos, because most of the Latinos who were in the Lubbock area at that time, in the Panhandle and the South Plains, were migrant workers. And so they were very transitory. They didn't set up permanent residence there. That came later, in later years. So I didn't get an opportunity to really rely on my Spanish-speaking ability and my knowledge of the Hispanic community. And so that's how I ended up doing a lot of stories about African Americans, which is part of my education as well. So the student newspaper, pretty good newspaper. By the time I graduated, my senior year, there was another young man in the pipeline. His name is Robert Montemayor. He might be familiar to a lot of my colleagues because Robert was this tremendously talented young man, came up, and he had come via migrant stream. And he went on to become the first Latino editor, executive editor of the University Daily at Texas Tech. And in his career, he went on to become a Pulitzer Prize winner at the Los Angeles Times. So he and I became, very good friends and remained friends all these years.
Having preceded him in working at the Texas Tech Daily, is that
University Daily. Yeah.
University Daily. Was there any advice that you gave him about
Yeah, I did. I think Robert would have succeeded, with or without that advice. But I think I hope that our friendship allowed me to criticize him, critique some of his work, provide him at least clear a path for him, so that by the time that he came along, it was no big deal to have a Hispanic in the newsroom. The thing about Robert, he was just an outstanding personality, very outgoing, and at that time he had a big afro, so he was quite a character. And I'm more quiet and reserved. So I think by the time Robert came along, and I helped coach him on the ways that the university operated and the position that he was going to hold, may have cleared a little bit of a path for him. And I think, as I say, he probably would have been successful regardless, but hopefully I made it a little bit easier.
Do you remember any specific challenges being the only Latino in the newsroom at that time or was it just kind of?
The newsroom was kind of a sanctuary for me, because that is where I did have the respect of my fellow staff members. And in fact, the executive editor surprised me at our closing banquet. We would always have a banquet at the end of the school year. He surprised me in my senior year because I didn't even know such a award existed, but they give an award for the top staff member of the student newspaper. So I had no expectation. I didn't even know the award existed, and went to the banquet and watched these other people getting these prizes and these awards. And then they announced, and the winner of this year's top student reporter on the University Daily is Ray Chavez. And then my editor went up there and got the plaque, and I went up there and I was totally shocked, totally unexpected. So I was very, very prized. Texas Tech and Lubbock itself is a different story. Because it's changed over the years, and now the environment there is very good for minorities in general, but particularly the Latinos, because they become more permanent residents of the area. But at that time, it was difficult dealing with the ultra-conservative, sometimes backwards and sometimes bigoted community of Lubbock. Getting off campus was a challenge, because that's where I would run into individuals who either would ignore me or make snide remarks, or once they knew that I was Mexican American, would say something about that. It's just unusual for them. And so I, at one point, very frustrated, I believe it was in my junior year, I decided, no, I'm sorry, it was my freshman year. I said, I've had enough. I'm leaving here. I'm going back to El Paso, back where I belong. And fortunately, I had a good roommate. Because on the track team, you were assigned a roommate. You didn't get to choose. And he was from Denver, so he was not a Texan. And so he saw me packing my bags, and he asked me what was wrong. I said, I'm getting the hell out of here. I'm going back home. I'm done. And he said, well, let's sit down and let's talk about it. His name is Lance Harder. And we talked, and we talked, and we just kept talking. He tried to convince me. He said, no, you belong here. You deserve to be here. You're one of the best guys on the track team. You're my roommate. I respect you, so on and so forth. And we talked, and I looked up, and I saw the sun coming out. We had literally talked all night long. And he convinced me to stay. And to this day, we're very close. I just saw him a couple of weeks ago because he's the head track coach of the women's track team at the University of Arkansas. And so they came to Austin for the Texas relays. And again, I got to see him. We had lunch together. And it's just like old times. But I always cite Lance Harder as the guy who convinced me to stay at Texas Tech and tough it out. He was my support.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess. Uh,
Okay, I just thought of something that I'd
Please.
like to add. Give you an idea of what it was like out in the community, even the professional community. You had to have an internship in order to graduate. And I was having a hard time getting an internship in the South Plains area because I had to look beyond Lubbock. The Lubbock Avalanche Journal, the daily newspaper in Lubbock. Again, very ultra conservative. They probably did not want to take me on as an intern because, how could I possibly be the best intern available from Texas Tech at that time? And so they had their pick. And I couldn't find an internship. So I was fortunate to get a phone call from a gentleman who was the executive editor of a small weekly newspaper that was distributed in the black section of town. And he called me because he said he had read some of my stories in the student newspaper and wanted to know if I'd be interested in working part-time for the West Texas Times, his newspaper. He started it, he funded it, and he was the editor of it. And I said, well, I'm kind of desperate for an internship. I didn't tell him that. And I said, yeah, I'll be glad to. And so I ended up as an intern at the West Texas Times. And again, that was part of my education because here I was, this guy named Ray Chavez, little Chicanito, working in what essentially was the ghetto at that time of East Lubbock in the black neighborhood. And so the black folk there couldn't quite get the connection. I said, are you really with the West Texas Times, the black newspaper? And I said, yes, I am. And then, it was a tremendous experience. Not only did I get a good internship, but it expanded my horizons and really convinced me of the need for diversity because the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, the mainstream newspaper, was not covering East Lubbock. The West Texas Times was, and I said, why is that? Why did they have to establish their own newspaper to get news and information out to their community? And why was the mainstream newspaper ignoring an important part of the community? And so that kind of got me down the road to thinking about diversity more than terms about what's happening to Latinos. You say, what's happening in the black community? What is happening with Asian Americans? Those kinds of things. It kind of expanded my horizons and made me think in a more broader sense about diversity.
Boy, but you're just anticipating all of my questions. You're making it really easy for me. The next question was, at what point did you become aware of the need for greater diversity? Mm-hmm. Would you say that was kind of
that was kind of the seminal moment? I mean, my coursework at Texas Tech had led me to start developing ideas beyond my own personal experience. I took, for example, a lot of courses in African American studies, particularly history. I love history. And later history became one of my research areas. I was actually trained at the University of Washington as a journalism historian. So in taking those courses, I began to learn more and more about the experiences of African Americans. And then, again, thanks to T.J. Patterson, who was the editor of the West Texas Times. He was a professor in the College of Business at Texas Tech. So I learned from him more than just journalism. I learned, about the economics of the black community, that sort of thing. And so that experience of being on the West Texas Times influenced me to take broader diversity of coursework on social issues, social sciences, political science, those kinds of things, and found it interesting. And I was fascinated by it. It just kind of rejuvenated my career interests, so that I decided at that time that whatever I do in the future, there will definitely be a diversity component to it.
Do you think that had to do with kind of your own background coming from a Hispanic background in El Paso and an indigenous background?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's kind of what drew you to to being interested in those perspectives or those narratives, those stories?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think in some ways growing up in El Paso was isolating because the majority of the population in El Paso is Latino, usually first generation Mexican Americans or Mexican immigrants. And I grew up in the barrio, and most of my friends and neighbors were Latinos. The high school I went to was, I believe, 85–90% Hispanic, maybe 5% black, and then 5% white. So my interactions with white people was minimal. And so I never experienced a lot of discrimination, although I noticed that, city council members were white, legislators were white, very few of the shakers, the movers and shakers in El Paso were Latino, and that kind of seemed curious to me, that this disparity, that most of the people are Hispanic, but most of the leadership is white. So going to Lubbock was eye-opening because Lubbock was predominantly white, and as I said, conservative, and so that change, that reality of what really most of America was like, as opposed to the Southwest, that was eye-opening, and so I think that served as a catalyst for me to look in broader terms of what can I do as an individual to educate my community about other people of color that live and exist and contribute to this community. And then having the experience with the black community that furthered that, because I realized, well, I have to learn myself. How can I teach others if I don't know myself? And not be so ignorant about other people and other cultures, and be more open to learning about other communities. So it was a good experience, although it was not easy. Sometimes it was tough.
Can I ask about the news that you consumed growing up or in college? Was it mostly kind of local news or national, international, radio, newspaper?
My dad was an avid newspaper reader. He subscriber to the daily newspaper and Sunday paper. Sunday mornings for us were per usual. It said you would get up in the morning and have breakfast, usually menudo, and then we would sit around and we would take pieces of different portions of the newspaper. And of course, I always started out with the comics, and this was the mainstream newspaper in El Paso, and it was English. But my grandfather, being only Spanish speaking, he would get the Mexican newspapers, and there were a lot of Mexican newspapers available in El Paso because of Juarez, immediately across the border. So I read mostly the English newspapers because my dad wanted me to learn English, but on occasion I would try to read some of the Spanish newspapers, the Mexican newspapers. And then my grandmother, who is an indigenous person, part Tarahumara from Mexico and part Mescalero Apache from the United States, southern New Mexico. She was blind. She could not see. And grew up in the same household with her. She listened to a lot of radio. And of course the radio she listened to was all the Spanish language stations. So there was always radio, Spanish language radio in our home. There was always Latino music in our house. Everybody loved music, so we always had music playing, and of course it was mostly Spanish language stations. And that kind of was the experience that I had growing up, and so my news and information were coming from all these variety of sources: the mainstream newspaper, the Spanish language newspapers, the radio stations. It came from a variety of those things. When we watched television together, usually in those days the family watched television together. It was usually one television in one room, not like it is today where everybody has their own medium. We would watch a lot of the Spanish language stations from Juarez. And that's where I would get my news and information. So I think I was pretty well informed growing up because I got it from this variety of sources.
I guess moving on.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it feels like I have to dig the answers out of people.
Sure.
But you're making it easy on me, so I appreciate that. We're curious about kind of once you there's some questions about kind of your professional experience practicing journalism.
Sure. Uh-huh.
So maybe you could just narrate for me going from school to practicing journalism.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah.
I was one of the fortunate ones in that I had a job offer before I graduated. I was a December graduate because it took me one additional semester to complete all my studies. And throughout all that time, my junior, senior year, I was working for the student newspaper and for the West Texas Times. So I had a lot of experience, and before I graduated, I had a job offer, fortunately, from my hometown, which was doubly unusual. Just to have a job offer alone was something, but then to have it from your hometown newspaper, I said, wow, that's great. So I didn't even go through commencement exercises at Texas Tech because as soon as my last class and last final was over, I had to pack up everything and move to El Paso because I had to start work the following Monday. So I had to skip my own graduation. So I didn't even go through that. And sure enough, as soon as I was done, went back to my apartment, packed up everything I had, and went off to El Paso and started work the next Monday. It was in December. It was Christmas. I had to work through the holidays because the regular staff would be given time off, and being the rookie, I would have to come in and fill in for them. And so, that's where my professional career started. And I was fortunate it was in El Paso because I knew the community. And so that gave me a leg up in that maybe I was this raw rookie and hadn't quite learned his craft yet, but at least I knew the community and I had sources already, ready-made sources there that I could, rely on for good information. So that's where my career started. And in a way sort of ended up years later. But from there, in other newspapers that I've worked for, included the Seattle Times. I worked for them when I went off to graduate school at the University of Washington in Seattle. And then after I got my graduate degree at the UW, we call it, I went to work for the Yakima Herald Republic, which is in eastern Washington state, the Yakima Valley. And I worked there. I would have stayed there, but what drove me away was the eruption of Mount St. Helens. Great story to cover. Fantastic experience covering it as a journalist. But a terrible personal experience because the ash cloud dumped all its volcanic ash in the Yakima Valley. It has a very high silicon content. I was extremely allergic to the ash. I was miserable physically. And so I didn't want to raise my family in that environment. There were just too many questions about what the long-term health effects would be on people in the valley daily breathing in this dust. So I took the first job available, and it happened to be in teaching in California at San Jose State University. I always say San Jose State because it's very popular to say in the United States, San Jose State. Well, my grandfather's name is Jose. And I could never say Jose because, my grandfather, that would be an insult to my grandfather. So San Jose State University offered me my first full-time teaching position. And I thought, well, I'll try it for a while. I really love journalism. This is just something that I'll do in the interim. And I actually did it for a couple of years. I've also worked at the Albuquerque Tribune for a while. I had an opportunity to work for the Miami Herald for about a 4 to 5 month period during one summer. So I've literally worked at newspapers from coast to coast, Seattle Times, Miami Herald, and enjoyed all those experiences. But something kept pulling me back, not only to journalism, but also to education. And in fact, it was UT El Paso, UTEP, that brought me back to El Paso once again, because they offered me a job as the advisor to the student newspaper, the Prospector. And that was a great experience. It was the first time that I had advised a student newspaper, and to have it happen in El Paso, where the majority of the staff were Latinos, first generation college students, I did not appreciate their talent until many years later, when I went through similar experiences at other colleges and university, how committed and how talented that first staff that I had was. And most of those individuals have gone on and have continued to work in journalism, have risen to positions of authority in newspaper work throughout the country. And so I was very fortunate to have that particular group to work with during my initial year. But again, it was a combination of journalism and education.
I guess, well, before we dive more into the education side,
Sure.
It seems like you've had some incredible experiences all over the country, so there are a few questions. Maybe some will apply to your work in Washington, some will apply to your work in El Paso, but feel free just to kind of
Sure.
pick and choose on what comes to mind. The first is about the stories that you reported or edited yourself, that you felt helped the cause of diversity. Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, several things come to mind. At the Seattle Times in Washington State, the largest minority group at that time that I was working there was actually the Asian American community. And they lived in an area of town called the International District. And although it's called the International District, it was really the Asian American community, mostly Japanese and Chinese. And I liked working in that community because I wanted to open up more of the Seattle Times coverage in that area. Plus, similarly to what had happened in Lubbock, working in the black community, I thought, here's another opportunity to learn about Asian Americans. And so that was eye-opening as well. Again, more of my personal education. So some of the stories that I wrote there were not blockbuster news stories so much as they were slice of life, culturally related stories, where I tried to explain a little bit more to the Seattle community what the Asian community was all about. For example, we did a story once about the Japanese gardens. You would go into the International District. It was really in the downtown area of Lubbock. And, it's just these multi-level buildings. There's not much character there. They're just buildings and sidewalks and streets. And there's a lot of Asian restaurants. Well, through learning about the community, I realized that the Japanese Americans like to garden, and there's no place to garden. So where do they garden? On the rooftops. And if you look at the International District from an aerial view, you'll see all these beautiful gardens on the rooftops. And of course, nobody knows about it except the people in the community, and nobody else in Seattle knows because you can't see them. You'd have to know that they were there and then go up to the top of the buildings and experience these gardens. So I wrote a story more than once about these beautiful gardens on the rooftops. And it was just, again, one of those slice of life where people I was opening the eyes of the community to these beautiful people that had this talent and cared about their neighborhood to beautify them, but they had nowhere to do it except on the rooftops. So I took particular pride in that kind of story. In Yakima, the Yakima Valley, that's where most of the migrant workers go. And I had a very good managing editor there by the name of Jim McNickey. And Mac wanted to expand coverage. He said, you know, I want to take advantage of your bilingual abilities. I want more stories about the migrant community. And so I took particular pride in a series of stories that I did about migrant workers coming to the Yakima Valley, and, you know, where they came from, how they survived, you know, where they moved on, how they educated their children, and so on and so forth. And wrote a series of stories about that community that, again, most people didn't know about because they were so transitory. But because I was able to go out into the fields with them, to mix and mingle with them, to have them accept me and trust me, even though I was from that newspaper, the mainstream newspaper, I was able to open up avenues of communication there and tell their story, give them voice. This was where I learned the phrase, give them voice. So that was gave me a very good feeling. I also began to get back in touch with my native roots because I began to realize that my grandmother was different, not just because she was blind, but because of her indigenous culture. And so the other large group of individuals that live in the Yakima Valley are the indigenous people, the Yakimas. And I started doing stories about the Yakima Indian Nation. And the greatest reward that I got from the Yakimas was not a plaque or a trophy or, you know, anything of that nature, is that I was invited to the opening of their Indian Cultural Center. They had just built a new center, and I had written a story about it. And so they invited all these quote-unquote dignitaries. And I thought I was invited because I was a reporter and they wanted me to cover the event. That's not why I was invited, because at one point during the activities, during the ceremonies to open this beautiful new cultural center, they had these young Indian maidens, these teenage girls, come out and they would do traditional dances. And at one point they stopped dancing, and the MC for the event, one of the tribal leaders, said, no, these young women are going to go up into the audience and pick someone to come down and join them in a dance, and this is a way of honoring your contributions to the Indian community. And one of these young girls came up to me and put out her hand and took my hand and took me down to the center of the arena to join them in a dance. That was an award, you know. That moved me more than many of the other types of awards that I would get, like plaques and awards and trophies and what have you, to be invited by the Yakima Indian Nation to join them on the floor of the arena and do a traditional Yakima dance. That almost brought me to tears, but it affirmed, it validated my value to that community, because they appreciated my news coverage, and they said that I had educated the larger community about what the Yakimas were all about. So that's one of those series of stories, not any one story, but a series of stories about the Yakimas that I take a great deal of pride in saying, yeah, I educated the community, and they appreciated it and showed it to me.
It seems like in the various places that you were working, you were kind of working to expand the coverage of whatever publication you were working for, so that they would be more aware of issues that were going on in the Asian or Native American or Hispanic community.
Right.
Were there any stories that, in spite of that, you felt went undercovered, or that the organization you were working for kind of still turned a blind eye to?
I think regardless of who you are and what your background is, you tend to be ethnocentric. And I'm no different than anybody else. You know, I identify greatly with the Latino community. I can identify greatly, although to a lesser extent, with the American Indian community. less so with African Americans and Asian Americans, but I'm still very much attuned to it. But I think still, the priorities rest in being Hispanic and covering Hispanic issues. And that's true for newsrooms, because newsrooms are made up of individuals, and these individuals come from their own communities. And when you have a newsroom that is predominantly white, they're going to rely on their own background, their own sources, and those sources tend not to be very diverse. So it's not, I love news people, and they are very open-minded. They're not bigoted people, but they do tend to fall back on what makes them comfortable. And it's difficult to get people out of their comfort zone in order to do things, and that includes news coverage. I mean, that's just human nature. So what I think I contributed was to getting my own colleagues to think in broader terms, to think about the community at large, not just their white counterparts, but also think about other people who live. And then that leads to income levels as well. The poor community gets less coverage than the mainstream community, and when it is covered, it's about crime. It's all crime news. And so why don't we go into the black neighborhood when it's graduation day, so that we can do stories about the students at the local high school that's predominantly black, and about the valedictorian, the salutatorian, and the kids there that have won prizes and awards and scholarships. We don't do those kinds of stories, but we're there the next second that there's a drug bust, or there's been a shooting, and that bothers me, because that community exists on a day-to-day basis, and on a day-to-day basis most of the people are decent, upright, law-abiding citizens who do things in their communities that are worth news coverage. It's not going to be whiz-bang news, but it's not all crime. It's not all drugs. It's not all of these, negative things. And so I think that I tried to bring that to the newsroom. And again, fortunately for me, when I got back in the newsroom after leaving UTEP, I got back into the newsroom with the Scripps Howard Corporation. They sent me to Albuquerque for the Albuquerque Tribune. And Albuquerque and El Paso have a lot in common. Very similar in that it's predominantly Hispanic. And I was an assistant city editor in Albuquerque and did that for a while, and worked with my immediate supervisor, city editor, in expanding news coverage along more positive lines in the Latino community, and then got sent back by Scripps Howard to their newspaper in El Paso, the El Paso Herald-Post, and came back as assistant city editor, and then a few months later was promoted to city editor. So now I'm in a position to make decisions. Now I am an authority, and I have the power to supervise people, and I have power to make decisions on what we cover and what we don't cover. And I had a very supportive staff who understood this, because quite a few of them, not the majority, but quite a few of them were also from El Paso and were Hispanic and mostly Mexican American. And so we were able to change the agenda, to push our agenda, and to establish new lines of thinking about what constitutes news. And I think we changed the culture of it, because I think the Herald-Post became known as the newspaper for the minority community, as opposed to the El Paso Times. And we did a lot of stories. Some of them were negative. I mean, we didn't ignore some of the things that happened in the community. You can't ignore the problem with high burglary rates and auto thefts there. It's all tied into the drug trafficking. And we did some stories about drug trafficking, and sometimes at risk. From the drug lords who, one time the drug lord put one of our reporters on a hit list. One time I had to literally rescue a photographer who had been arrested by some of the federal police in Juarez. who were tied into the drug trade, because we'd written a series of stories about the close connection between government officials and the drug traffickers. And they didn't like us, and so they actually arrested one of our photographers, and we had to rush down and save him before they beat him. In some cases, he could get beat to death. Those kind of stories we did, but we knew we had the contacts, so we did those stories because it was news. But we also did a number of other stories where I got to decide what the priority was. We did one called the Streets of El Paso. In El Paso, if you're familiar with it, what happens is people don't identify themselves as being from certain neighborhoods. They mostly identify themselves from being from certain streets. Okay, they say, well, we're from Alameda, we're from Alameda, and that's Alameda Street, which goes into the barrio. We're from South El Paso Street, which is the neighborhood that's immediately adjacent to Juarez. So we did the Streets of El Paso as opposed to the neighborhoods of El Paso, and again, that's that cultural connection, and it's slice of life again, not breaking news, but again, just educating the community about itself. And so as city editor, I was blessed that we had a staff that was energetic, devoted, committed to community service. And I had their support whenever I would go to the executive editor and try to argue for funding certain projects. And it seemed to work.
That's incredible. The whole time I have to just restrain myself from saying whoa or wow or
Yeah.
I guess the follow-up question is kind of regarding the outcome of your kind of changing the agenda, either there or as a reporter, either as the city editor or as a reporter in any of your jobs. Did you ever suffer any negative repercussions?
Yeah.
Or positive repercussions?
Both. I mean, as a news person, you can't be driven or governed by your popularity. I often would tell my students many years later, say, if you're getting into this just to be popular, so forget about it. You're not going to be popular. You're not going to be always accepted by everyone. Some of the most negative comments that we would get would actually come from the Latino community. When we would do some stories that were critical about some of the things that were happening in our neighborhoods. Prime example of that was in El Paso, where we did a story about these shooting galleries, as we call them. A shooting gallery is the term that was used for abandoned houses where heroin addicts go to shoot up. And there were a lot of old abandoned houses in El Segundo Barrio, the Second Ward in El Paso, South Side El Paso. And the city was not doing anything about these abandoned houses. And so it was well known to the city and to law enforcement officials that this is where the drug addicts would go, break into these abandoned houses, and then just use them as shooting galleries. Well, it was in my grandmother's old neighborhood. And when my reporters came back to me and told me, this is what's going on in this neighborhood, I said, well, this is my grandmother's old neighborhood. She had long since passed away. And I said, how can that be? If this were to happen on the affluent west side of town, the city would have immediately done away with these shooting galleries and would have made arrests or put these people in rehabilitation centers and what have you. But because it's happening in the poor side of town, nothing is happening. So we immediately did some stories on it. Where we got the heat from the Latino community was we took photographs, and we had a front page photograph of a teenage boy in the shooting gallery, literally shooting up. Had the tourniquet on, and he had the needle in his arm, and he was injecting the heroin into his arm. Teenage boy, maybe 15, 16, 17 years old. Front page picture, because our thinking was we want to shock the community. Well, we got a lot of heat from the Latino community because they said, how could you do that? How could you take a photograph of this boy and not prevent him from doing that? Or how can you embarrass us by showing, that this is what's going on in our neighborhood? And the truth was, it was going on in that neighborhood. So we had to tell the truth. But the reason, the motivation behind it was to shock the community so that they would put pressure on the city to clean it up. And that's exactly what happened. But during that process, we got a lot of criticism from the Chicano leaders in town that we were exploiting, that this child was not rescued. Law enforcement authorities later told us, the one thing you never want to do with a drug addict is try to take that needle away, because they will turn on you, because that is everything to them. And so that to try and take that needle out of that boy's arm, he could easily have turned around and injected your photographer with it. And so you never do that, not in the process, because that is their entire world, and they will fight their own mothers to get that heroin in their arms. So even though the authorities, the community didn't buy it, and so that's why we were accused of exploiting this issue in order to quote unquote sell more newspapers. Well, we didn't want to sell more newspapers. What we wanted to do was to show this quite graphically what was happening in this neighborhood, in my grandmother's old neighborhood. My personal motivation was, this is an insult to my grandmother, and I want this cleaned up in her old neighborhood that she cared a great deal about. And that there are some decent people living there, but they're having to live amidst all these drug dealers and these heroin addicts. So in the long run, it did work out fine, but we did get quite a bit of criticism. So if you're doing your job, you're going to do what Robert Montemayor said. Again, Robert, who went on to win a Pulitzer Prize at the LA Times. One of the things that he did at Texas Tech is he changed the logo to the student newspaper. I believe the logo used to say official student publication of Texas Tech University. He changed that when he became editor of the University Daily. He said, "It is the purpose of this newspaper to raise constructive hell." Now, the operative word is constructive. Okay, anybody can raise hell. But raising constructive hell means that you're raising issues that are going to upset people. But if it leads down the road to a betterment of that community or that neighborhood, then you've done your job. But it is constructive hell, and people will criticize you for it because they're always second-guessing you. And so, those are the kinds of stories that journalists should do, and you're going to get some heat. And people will not like you, will not be popular. But if in the long term, the end result of what you've done leads to a betterment of a neighborhood, then you've done your job. And now you move on, and you move on to the next issue. And I think that's what needs to be done, and that's what I see lacking in today's news coverage.
Inside of the newspapers themselves, within the newsroom, were there ever any negative repercussions for trying to change the agenda or change the focus of coverage?
Yeah, I think we would. Most of the time, it was pretty supportive. Sometimes, when we talk about within the newspaper, I think in terms of within a news organization, because the El Paso Herald-Post was only one of several newspapers owned by the Scripps-Howard Corporation. And like most corporations, they like to kind of have this template for their newspapers that we want you to do this and that and emphasize this and that. And they're always thinking in terms, not always, but most of the time they're thinking in terms of the bottom line, the income, the fiscal health of the newspaper. So we were visited by representatives of the Scripps Howard Corporation wanted to meet with our staff to talk about some of the things that we should be doing, some of the stories we should be covering. So we're listening to this presentation, the entire staff, photographers, reporters, editors, all us, supervising editors. And the presentation gets on to talking about lifestyle issues. Now this is El Paso, Texas, right? Border town, border economy. And they started talking about, you need to cover things that people can do after work, and things about health. And so do some stories about some of the, what do you call them, the fitness places, the gyms that people can sign up for and what they can expect to do at the local gym. And also do more stories about daycare. And my staff is looking at me and I'm looking at them, and we're reading each other. We're mind reading. And we're looking at these executives or these people from Scripps Howard within the organization, but they've come from Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati is a very different community from El Paso, Texas. And so at one point, one of the veteran reporters stands up and said, wait a minute, we got to stop you. Said, because, this is a blue-collar town. These are working class people. They are laborers. When they come home from work, they're not going to go to a gym. They're not going to go to a gym before work. They're not going to work out because, they are involved in hard physical labor most of their working lives. They just want to get home and be with their family. So to write these stories about gyms, local gyms and fitness centers, you're only speaking to a small segment of the community, and that's the people in the Upper West Side, the wealthy part of town. So that has nothing to do with the majority of the community. And then another one pipes up, and this was very, very telling. He says, "Did you know what we call daycare in El Paso?" And they say, "No, what do you call daycare in El Paso?" They say, "Tia," or "Maria," or "Lupe." Is the people that are hired by the working class laborers, they come across the border and they work as your maid, but they also become the nannies to your children. And they look after your children. You don't need daycare. You need a good nanny. And we don't call them nannies. They're just, maids that come across the border, and they clean your home, but they also take care of your kids. And so daycare does not exist to a great extent in El Paso because of that situation. And these women, they take good care of those kids. They care about those kids. And sometimes those kids will call them tia, call them, my aunt, Tia Rosa, Tia Maria, and sometimes your own aunt, your extended family will be that person who comes to your house and cleans and takes care of the kids while you're off working hard. I said, so anyway, we hit these individuals with these realities of what El Paso is like, and finally I said, you know what? I think this session's over. I said, we feel insulted that you come in here and try to tell us how to do our jobs, and you know nothing about our community. I said, so next time you take this, dog and pony show on the road, you better educate yourselves about the communities you're going into before you start, with these template procedures, these templates about what should be covered. He said, because that's not going to work here. I said, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm done. And I walked out. And most of the staff got up and walked out either. And so they were just kind of left, with their mouths open. I said, okay. He said, so it probably did not win me a good report to Scripps Howard headquarters in Cincinnati. I said, but it didn't matter because we told them the truth and said, you're wrong. So those kinds of things existed within newsrooms, and I say that within newsrooms because editors are promoted not by the local community; they're promoted by the corporation. And so Scripps Howard, like Gannett and like Knight Ridder and all these other news corporations, they promote their editors mostly based on the fiscal health of the newspaper, and they promote them because they fall in line with whatever the standards are of the corporation and not of the community. And so you end up with some pretty bad editors in communities that they know nothing about. You know.
So based on their focus groups that they'd done in Cincinnati, they figured out
Yeah,
what you needed to cover.
exactly. You know, focus. I don't think they ever did a focus group in El Paso, and they'd have to be extremely selective in how they, you know, identified individuals in the community. But yeah, it was based on Cincinnati and all their other newspapers around. Knoxville, Tennessee was another area. Our executive editor came from Knoxville, and you know, he had a good heart, had right intentions, but it took him a long time to understand El Paso. It's a very unique setting along the border.
I think we've done just about an hour at this point.
Okay.
Did you say you wanted to take
Yeah,
a break?
let me go
just
ahead.
to let
Well, he's pretty
Jen
calm
go
right
ahead?
now, so I'm kind of. Yeah, okay. No,
Take a little break?
We'll
Or keep chugging along?
let's
until
chug
he-
along a little bit
until
longer.
he gets a little anxious?
As long as he's calm.
Okay.
He'll let me know.
Okay.
He will definitely let me know.
Okay. So the next question, again, just kind of speaking to all of your various experiences working in different places and different positions. As far as you could see, or as far as you can tell, did you feel that the journalists of diverse backgrounds, so either ethnicity or being women or gay or lesbian or transgender, do you feel that they were able to rise through the ranks of the newsroom, that they were treated fairly?
Mm-hmm.
Did you see?
I think a lot depends on the situation. I know that the women that I've had the pleasure of working for and with did not get paid as well as the men. So I think equity in pay is still a major issue. Not just in our industry, in our profession, but you know, throughout the country. The gay issues are still being debated. I don't think that individuals are judged, but I think that newsrooms as a whole have a hard time dealing with gay issues. I guess that's the newest frontier, and that's a good sign that it is being addressed. It certainly wasn't addressed too much during my times in the newsroom. It's an issue that I tried to address in my teaching, in my classes, and in academia, and I think it has filtered down. That's a generational push too. I think the current generation is much more open-minded and tolerant of the gay community than mine was, especially in Hispanic communities or largely Christian or Roman Catholic communities, where it's also a religious issue. So there has been some progress, but we still got a long way to go. As far as having gay reporters in the newsroom, I don't think I have ever seen conflicts there, at least not in my experience. I think because, again, journalists, I love reporters, tend to be much more open-minded and tolerant than, say, any other business. And so we tend to be more open-minded and accepting of individuals who are different from us. And when you have that good mix in the newsroom, ethnic and racial mix, I think it leads to other issues, and a good mix of men and women. because always think of it like a family, in that a family doesn't always agree, and they can argue with one another, but in the end they always come back together because they love one another and they respect one another. And I think that's what happens in newsrooms, is you get to be a family. And so we will argue. Oh, we had some great arguments when we were discussing, issues that needed to be covered. But we never called each other names. We would get loud, we would get passionate, and then we would try to resolve the issue, and then we always came together. We would always go out for a beer later, that kind of thing, and that's what I liked about journalists, is that we move on. It's not always the case with people in academia. People in academia can hold grudges for years, but in the newsroom, you just move on. Tomorrow's another day. Tomorrow we put together another newspaper. And I did a little bit of radio for a while too. And that's what would happen in the radio station. I did a bilingual broadcast on a public broadcast station at UT El Paso, at UTEP, and it was called El Paso Adelante. We would do the first half hour in English and then the second half hour in Spanish, and try to replicate what we had said in English, but sometimes we'd go off on tangents. And we'd get phone calls from the community with call-in basis. So that was an interesting experience. And so we would get arguments, about what we were saying on the air. And then at the end of the day, you said, okay, that's over. Tomorrow will be another broadcast. Let's move on. So I like that. I respect that. And I appreciate that about journalists, being able to move on and address these other issues. So when you have that diversity in the newsroom, it's become part of the family. And so you can express your point of view, gay issues, women's issues, whatever the case may be. So I've seen that improvement because it's become more diversified.
Yeah. You just knocked out maybe 2 or 3 questions. Okay. I mean, I guess the next chunk of questions is related to the AEJMC.
Okay.
Are you a member of the AEJMC?
I have been a member on and off through the years, and again, because I have bounced back and forth between academia and the newsroom, although the last few years has been strictly in higher education. So yeah, I have been a member, and I've also been a member of the accrediting council. There's AEJMC, and then there's the ACEJMC, the accrediting council of the education, etc., which is the agency, that branch that goes out and accredits programs, journalism programs, and mass comm programs around the country. So I've seen it from that point of view too, which is a different experience. So I want to separate the two. AEJMC, important organization. It's a good vehicle for people to share ideas and to share innovations, and for individuals to keep up to date with what's going on in higher education, in journalism and mass communication, and to go to conferences, workshops, and what have you. It's kind of a continuing education, because you don't want to become static, or stagnant, I should say. We don't want to be stagnant, and so AEJMC serves a good purpose in that it keeps us up to date. And you can go there and meet with colleagues, and I often say that I'm a good thief, in that I steal good ideas from other people and then incorporate it to my own teaching, my own activities, and they're quite willing to say, we need to share those ideas and those innovations. So that's the good sense of that. I don't know what the exact figures are. You don't have to be a member of AEJMC. It's very beneficial if you are, especially if you're a researcher. I think it probably has more benefit to researchers than to what I would classify as practitioners. So if you're primarily involved in teaching news writing, reporting, photography, courses like that, the skills courses, AJMC is probably not as useful to you. It's useful to you, but not to the extent that it would be for someone who's doing research. Because I find that most of the papers that are presented at their conferences are research oriented. Those of us who came up through the ranks of the news business rely on our newsroom experiences to help us with those courses, the skills courses. So I haven't found AEJMC to be particularly more useful to me when it comes to teaching those kinds of courses, but it does help, for example, when I teach history of journalism, one of my research areas. And so I was a member of the history division of AEJMC. So it all depends on what you're looking for. Like as with any organization, you always want to look at what they have to offer before you decide to join or not. And when you join, is it going to be beneficial for you? So that's why I've bounced around. I've been a member, but it hasn't been consistent from the first time that I joined. The first time I joined, I was a graduate student at the University of Washington. And that was mostly because AJMC had their national conference at the University of Washington in Seattle, and being a graduate student there, I saw it as a good opportunity for me to not only look at the research that was being done, but also to establish a network, which I guess is the other aspect of any organization. You establish a nationwide or international network of contacts, so that if you want to find a job in, say, the East Coast, and you're likely to find a fellow AJMC member there who can help you. So I think that's the greatest benefit of AJMC. So I joined because my mentor, Professor Roger Simpson at the University of Washington, recommended that I join, and he was instrumental in getting me to be appointed to be a monitor for one of the presentations on journalism history, based on a paper that I had written that eventually became my thesis, which was a history of Spanish language journalism in the Pacific Northwest. And so when everybody came for the conference, I was able to present my paper and then monitor or moderate a panel of other historians who had looked at the development of Spanish language media in non-Southwestern states. Because it was not Southwestern states pretty well documented: Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, what have you. But not much was written about what was happening in Oregon, Idaho, Washington, those areas, and then the Midwest. So it was a good opportunity. So I joined at that time and was a member during my early years of working in academia. I dropped membership when I graduated from the University of Washington, because then I went back to the newsroom at the Yakima Herald-Republic. And then I rejoined again when I started working for San Jose State University in California. So whenever I changed jobs and changed positions, that's when I would rejoin if it was an academic position, because I didn't find that useful to me as a working journalist. But as an academician, as a researcher, and as an educator, I did find it useful. It's been an on-off relationship, but a good relationship over the years.
And over the years, have you seen the organization change or evolve, or?
Yeah, because I think initially, my first experience with the organization, I was pretty critical, because that's essentially what my paper was about. What my paper said, and as I said, it eventually became my thesis, said that most of what I learned in my journalism classes, my mass communication classes at Texas Tech University and University of Washington, dealt with mainstream media, and that very little information was about non-mainstream minority media those kinds of things. Like those are kinds of things that I had to go out and research and learn on my own, or from other faculty members in non-mass communication disciplines. Like on my graduate committee, I had a historian, Latino, from the history department, who provided me a lot of good information and resources on the Latino experience in the Pacific Northwest, and then that launched into work about how they communicated with one another. But from the mass comm program, not all that much. Roger Simpson was extremely supportive, but he admitted to me, and I thank him for that he admitted his shortcomings in not knowing much about the Latino community. So that's how well we worked together, because he was willing to admit what he did not know. And there's some people in academia who will not admit that to you. They've got this PhD, right? And it says that they know everything. And so they will not admit when they're ignorant or they don't know. It's something you rarely hear a professor say, I don't know. And I have much more respect for someone who says, I don't know about that, but I can help you find the information. So AEJMC, if I were to criticize it, is sometimes we fall into that pattern, in that in order to get first a bachelor's, then you get a master's, and then you go on to a PhD, sometimes you become a little bit more narrow, because you are now limiting your activities to survival in academia in order to get tenure, to get certain positions, and then you got to concentrate on your research. And so it doesn't help you to see the broader picture. And that's unfortunate, but it's kind of a pattern that I've seen in some professors. I'm not criticizing all of them, but in some professors where they just get too narrow a point of view and can't see the bigger picture.
And over time, do you think that pattern has become more prevalent, or less so, or kind of been the same?
In some ways the same. Is status quo. Who gets promoted, who gets tenure, and it's the individuals who still produce the most published research. And people will argue to the contrary, that we've become a little bit more accepting of a non-traditional research, and that's true. But I think when it comes to universities still pretty much fall back on traditions. It's a very tradition-bound profession. And so they rely on traditional research. What referee journals have you published in, as opposed to, what videos did you produce? What documentaries did you put together? That sort of thing. And so I think, we're breaking away from that, but it's an evolution, not a revolution. And it's going to take a few more years before it becomes more accepting. To accept research, non-traditional research, on the same level as written research. So it's changing, but we're in the middle of the evolution. It hasn't been a revolution.
With regards to the way that it addresses diversity in journalism education, or promotes diversity in journalism education, kind of where do you feel the AEJMC falls, and what changes have you seen?
I think the most productive change has been in the creation of more divisions and interest groups that address diversity issues. They've expanded the number of these different groups, these divisions, and what happens is that, for example, if you're concerned about gay issues or women's issues or African American issues, there's these different groups. They call them interest groups, which can evolve into divisions. And what happens with those is then people who are interested in those research areas can join those groups, and then it becomes part of the mainstream of the larger organization. You can begin to push more of those issues when it comes to curriculum design, new coursework, Accrediting. Accrediting is, a very important factor in all of this. And so in the accreditation process, there are now more vehicles than when I first joined the organization. Then there, that begin to push those kinds of issues onto the agenda. Now, human beings being what they are, again, it's difficult for them to get out of their comfort zone. So if you're doing research in one particular narrow area and then you're told, well, where's the diversity factor here? They get quite defensive and say, well, this has nothing to do with diversity. Well, there are very few topics that have nothing to do with diversity. And so when you try to push those individuals to be more diverse in terms of ethnicity, race, gender, etc., it's like pulling teeth. It's difficult for them to break out of that comfort zone, and they feel very defensive about their own research, and don't want to go back and redo things that are going to include those kinds of perspectives, especially if you've already got tenure. If you already have tenure, then what are you worried about? You've got a certain amount of job security there, so why reinvent the wheel here? I'll just stay in my comfort zone. That's the nature of academia in general.
So then, do you think that the one of the places where the AEJMC can have the most impact is with accreditation? Well, I guess accreditation is of the institution or the program in general,
right.
And not specifically dealing with professors on the tenure track.
Here again, here's where I have to make the distinction between AEJMC and ACEJMC. The Accrediting Council is an offshoot because it is the one accrediting vehicle that has the power to grant or not grant accreditation. And they're the ones who have a more direct impact on a program because they include a diversity standard. They have a number of standards that they look at across the board: graduation rates, finances, curriculum, etc., and diversity is one of them. So when I have served on accrediting site teams that evaluate programs, I'm usually assigned to look at their diversity, among other standards, but diversity I've always volunteered to be the one to look at that situation because of my expertise. And that's where they are, I guess, less aggressive. I would like to see more aggressive action being taken to not accredit programs who have great deficiencies in diversity. And there are very few, if any, programs that have lost their accreditation because, even though they failed the diversity standard, they still got accredited. And you kind of have to look at the history of accreditation to see that there are few, if any, that have lost accreditation because of the failure on diversity standards. But that's ACEJMC. AEJMC, it's a little bit more political in that I think AEJMC, the membership as a whole, has to be more aggressive about pushing that agenda and saying, diversity is important. We believe that if you're going to have a quality program, you must have diversity. You must address the diversity standards with or without accreditation, is just because it's so important. Because we live in a nation that is extremely more diverse than it was in, say, the 1950s or the 40s. I mean, the AEJMC goes back, I think, back to about 1912, if I recall the history correctly, 1912, and then it's evolved over the years. So it's a very old organization, but I don't think they're as aggressive in addressing diversity as they should be. They've come a ways, but again, they've got a long way to go to make that particular standard of quality a primary issue.
And I guess probably your basis for thinking about that comes from your own experience in academia, um, in journalism and mass communication education, kind of what you saw in terms of what programs were doing to address diversity in could you tell me a little bit about your own experiences in places that you've worked in academia specifically, and whether or not what kind of the shortcomings were of those programs, those places,
Mm-hmm.
and but also maybe some of the things that you saw that places were doing right.
Yeah. I think the main criticism or the main deficiency is in the curriculum, where courses that address diversity are electives rather than required courses. And then within required courses, making sure that diversity is part of the course itself. So that there's diversity from outside and diversity within. So what I've seen in some programs is that faculty are required to incorporate diversity into their existing coursework and in coursework that is required of all their majors. And then I've seen the development of coursework that falls into the areas of electives, but are not required of students, and so the only ones who take those courses are the people who are most interested in it. So if you have a course on, say, women in the media, it's an elective. Well, who signs up for it? Women, female students. And it would be a course that would be of great benefit to male students, for men to take that course and see what it's like for women in the media. And to begin to address women's issues as a male. I learned this the hard way because it's mea culpa. Being a man, I didn't always address women's issues, and I always wasn't as sensitive to women's issues until the University of Colorado, where the Association for Women in Communications student chapter needed a faculty advisor, and they couldn't find one, either because the other women were already assigned to so many other committees that they were overextended, and because none of the male faculty members wanted to be advisor to a women's club, a women's group. So I volunteered on a temporary basis. I said, well, if you need an advisor, I told the dean, I'll be glad to advise them on a temporary basis until you can find a permanent advisor, meaning a female faculty member. Well, turns out I learned as much from these young women as they learned from me, because once I became their advisor, we would discuss issues and I would learn what was on their mind, what kinds of experiences they were having. I said, oh, I hadn't even thought about that, and that sort of thing. So they educated me as much as I think I educated them about the field of journalism. So this temporary position as advisor went on for a semester, and then in the beginning of the next semester, I told the young women, I said, I signed on as a temporary advisor, and I think there's a female faculty member who would be interested in becoming your permanent advisor, and said, I can approach her about it, and what do you think? They said, no, we want you. I was surprised at their response. They said, no, we want you. We like working with you. And so I said, well, all right, if you think this is a good relationship. So I became the permanent advisor for the time that I was at the University of Colorado, and went on to join the National Association for Women in Communication, despite the fact that I'm a man, and that's you can join as a man, and I became a male member of the local chapter of Association for Women in Communication. So it was again another eye-opening experience, just like having learned from the African Americans in Lubbock and having learned from the Asians in Seattle. I learned from the women around me at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and it was good for my education. So I think that's part of the process, is that you've got to get more faculty members to do that sort of thing, and to, for AEJMC to push those issues, to get us to commit to community service in a broader sense, in a diverse sense. Hang on just one second. What I'm going to do is, I meant to do this earlier and I forgot. He sometimes shakes his head and this rings like a bell. Oh, puppy. We'll just take that off. All right. Now you can shake your head all you want. Okay.
Actually, I probably should have asked this earlier, but just so that we have it for the record, could you just kind of walk me through the different positions in academia that you've held?
Sure. First, full-time teaching. No, let me back up a bit. My first teaching experience was as a TA at the University of Washington, because as a graduate student you were assigned to different professors, and so I was one of several TAs for the Intro to Mass Media course at the UW, and so I kind of liked it. It was interesting. It was a new experience for me. I had not been in front of a classroom before. And so my advisor, again, my mentor, Roger Simpson, came to me and said, you get pretty good evaluations. He said, you might want to consider that as a career possibility. He said, I know you want to get back in the newsroom, become super journalists and all that. He said, but you have a knack. You've really connected with your students, and they like you, they appreciate it, and they tell me that they've learned a lot from you. And so I said, well, I'll think about it, it's a fallback plan. So when I graduated and then went back to the newsroom in Yakima, I didn't even think about it. I said, I'm not going to get into teaching. I've got a full-time position as a journalist. But when Mount St. Helens drove us away and I ended up at San Jose State, here was my first full-time teaching position, a full-time basis. And again, I found that I had a connection with the students, that I kind of had a knack for this, and that I could get them engaged. So that was for 2 years in Northern California. A kind of a teaching position was an advisor to the student newspaper at UTEP, because as advisor you also taught 1 or 2 courses a semester. And most of the same students that were on the student newspaper staff were also in my classes, so it became a natural. Then I left academia again, got back in the newsroom, assistant city editor in Albuquerque and city editor El Paso, so on and so forth. Then a couple of students from the University of Colorado that I had the pleasure of meeting when they came to El Paso for a conference had gone back to Colorado and told the dean about me. And they said, we think that Mr. Chavez down in El Paso would be an excellent professor to fill the position that they were trying to fill at Colorado School of Journalism. So they contacted me and sort of recruited me, and I said, well, okay, I'll throw my hat in the ring, see what happens, see if I get the offer, fine. If I don't, I'm fine with my job here. Now I got the job offer, and it was a pretty good offer. So got back in the newsroom. I'm back into academia, left the newsroom and got back into academia at the University of Colorado, where I sat down with the dean and we discussed what I was going to be doing, and then I asked him, where's the diversity component in all this curriculum, and they didn't have one. So I proposed to him the establishment of an Office of Student Diversity within the School of Journalism at Colorado. And he said it was a good idea. He liked the proposal, and not only did he get the faculty to approve the creation of this office, but he appointed me as director of the Office of Student Diversity. So that was a good opportunity to bring it all together. You know, my journalism experience, the diversity, and also to work within the academic setting to expand diversity education. And so within this Office of Student Diversity, I created, called it MEMO, the Multi-Ethnic Media Organization. And MEMO became, in the School of Journalism there, the organization for all the minority students, minority student journalists to join, because we had mutual interests and we could do a lot of things together. And so I was very proud of MEMO, and MEMO did well. After I left Colorado, they kept MEMO going, so that was good. You always want to leave a place and leave something behind that they can build upon. I don't know if MEMO exists now because it's been several years, but I think a form of MEMO is still there. And it's a good support group for all the minority students that end up in Boulder, Boulder's a weird community. It's a very progressive, what I call pseudo-liberal community. And so minorities there can sometimes feel uncomfortable because it's not part of the culture of Boulder, Colorado. And so it's good that they have a home in MEMO that they can go to and mutually support one another. That led to the University of South Dakota and the creation of the American Indian Journalism Institute. The most underrepresented group of American journalists are Native Americans. Not only because it's small in number, but because American Indians don't pursue careers in mass communication. So, a friend of mine, Jack Marsh from the Freedom Forum, the philanthropic arm of Gannett, one that was created by Al Newharth, the late Al Newharth of USA Today, and Denny McAuliffe, who is an Osage Indian who was teaching at the University of Montana and had worked for the Washington Post. The three of us got together and we created the American Indian Journalism Institute concept. You know, an institute that could act as kind of a boot camp to recruit American Indians and then give them initial training in journalism. Because of the connection of Al Newharth to the University of South Dakota, Al Newharth graduated in journalism from the University of South Dakota. They wanted to establish the institute at USD in Vermilion, and Jack Marsh recruited me to come and become the chairman of the journalism program there, but also to be the education director for this newly created AIJI, American Indian Journalism Institute. And it all came together. It just somehow all came together. And my wife is from South Dakota. She was born and raised in Sioux Falls. So it became just natural to say, okay, do you want to go back to South Dakota for a while or permanently or whatever? And she said, fine, let's go, let's do it. We ended up in South Dakota again, and she got back in touch with her family and her roots there. And while I was teaching at Vermilion and running the AIJI, I was also the chairman of the department, which gave me my first opportunity to be a manager, primarily an administrator. Not so much teaching, but supervising faculty and staff within the journalism program there. And in the summers, running this boot camp. So I designed the curriculum for the boot camp. And then Denny McAuliffe did the recruiting of the Indians, and then Jack Marsh provided the funding and the office support So it worked very well, and it did. It ended up producing more. That one program produced more American Indian journalists than any other previous program and any program since. And a lot of our AIGI graduates are now working professionals in the field, and we stay in touch with them. That led to the University of Oklahoma, because Oklahoma was initially established as Indian Territory. There are, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of 39 federally recognized tribes in Oklahoma. The University of Oklahoma had heard about what we had done in South Dakota and contacted me and said, would you come down here on a visiting professorship and help us to create a program that will be more attractive to American Indians? I said, yeah, sure, 1 year, why not? Go down there, take a leave of absence, go there for a year, work with Fred Blevins, Professor Fred Blevins, who I had known before when in his days at the San Antonio Express News. We both come from a journalism background. And he had already created it, but I came along to help him develop it. So give him all the credit, and we give Fred Blevins all the credit for creating the Oklahoma Institute for Diversity in Journalism. And then I came along after, because he soon left there, and then while we were there together for the year, we helped develop the program so that it would continue on. When he left, I took over. So I was hired for a year only. At the end of the year, they said, we like what you're doing here. We'd like to make you a permanent offer. Would you leave South Dakota and come down here and become our permanent executive director of the Oklahoma Institute for Diversity in Journalism? And that's how I ended up in Oklahoma. That's how a Texan ends up in Oklahoma. It's tough for a Texan to end up in Oklahoma. But we did it, and I was there for a little over 7 years. Yeah, so that's the whole academic aspect. But it's always been about diversity. It's always been the driving force and the driving motivation.
Can I ask, was it when you were an undergraduate student, a graduate student, before then, after then? When do you think you became aware of the need for more diversity in education of journalism education?
Probably at Texas Tech, because it was so different from El Paso, and being at Tech in a largely white community and being the first or only minority on the student newspaper there. There weren't, at that time, there weren't any African Americans on the staff, so I was the only one. That's when I recognized, I'm different. I have different points of view and perspectives. I can make a difference here. And then that continued through the years, both in academia and in journalism, because I was often either the only or one of very few minorities, either in the newsroom or on the faculty and staff. I don't like being a one and only, because you don't have many allies. So it worked better when there were other minorities, even though they might not be Latinos, in the newsroom or in the faculty, to become an ally in pushing those issues. So that's when I became aware that if you're going to have diversity in journalism, you got to have diversity in faculties too, because you can't teach what you don't know. You can't teach about news coverage in the Latino community if you've never covered the Latino community. You can't teach advertising for the Latino community if you've never advertised or marketed products in the Latino community. We buy different products from the mainstream. There aren't many white folks going out and buying menudo for Sunday morning, or know the difference between, tortillas de harina and tortillas de masa and stuff like that. There's a difference in tortillas and what you use them for. So, little things like that, and it's just weird. How are you going to teach advertising for products that are geared primarily for the Latino community, or hair products for the African American community, because the nature of their hair is different, and you've not had that experience in doing that? How do you teach others what you haven't done? And so that's the main criticism that I have of higher education in general, is that there are not enough of us, people of color, gay people. There's a lot of women in academia now, and I think that's why women's issues have risen to the forefront ahead of ethnic and racial issues, because there's more women and they push that agenda. But it's mostly white women. So what does a white woman know about the experiences of an African American teen growing up in a poor neighborhood? It's not within her experience. What does a white woman know about the needs, the cosmetic needs? I'm talking, blush and eyeliner and what have you, of a black woman, or an Asian woman, or a Latina. She doesn't. It's not within her experience unless you go out there and then you do it yourself. I didn't do it by design. As you learned, I did it almost by accident, to become more aware of what happens in the African American community and how to cover that community. I like to say, when I was in that community, I had a different accent. When I was dealing with black folk, what I would do is I'd go to church. I would go to church on Sundays with the black folk, because the church was the unifying thing in the black community. Church is more than just church. It's where black folk come together and talk about what's happening in the community. And so I would do that. See? When I would go out into the Latino community, hablaba en español. Y era diferente si estaba hablando en una comunidad que es mexicoamericano, que una comunidad que es de Puerto Rico. Tiene otros acentos diferentes. ¿Sabes lo que estoy diciendo? Así es la cosa. En Puerto Rico, different accents. It's just as different from someone from New York, New Jersey, going down into Alabama. We're down here in Alabama, and we don't speak like them folk up in New York. See? So I learned to diversify my approaches to people in order to be more accepting, but I had to know about their lives. And, is a white woman willing to go into a black neighborhood and deal with black teenagers? You got to do that. It's not just sympathy, it's empathy. And in order to empathize, you've got to go do it. And that's the main problem with higher education, is that, again, we are ethnocentric. That's human nature, to be ethnocentric. And in order to break out of that, you've got to go out and do some things that are uncomfortable for you. And you will survive, and you will be a better person for it. Yeah. So I think those things are important.
Would you say then that the major challenges to or in working on issues of diversity in journalism education is the training of the faculty, or is it the selection of the faculty? What are the major challenges, or what,
I think because I think part of it is recruitment, because minorities, I'm going to use a traditional definition of minorities using federal government guidelines. So you got African American, Asian American, Latino or Hispanic, etc. Okay, those minority groups, and a lot of them come up in unconventional ways. They don't come up in the traditional way that most people in academia do. And so some of them may not have PhDs. They may have advanced degrees. They get a bachelor's degree maybe in political science. And then they get a master's degree in communication, the way I did. And then don't have the money or the resources or even the will to go on to a PhD. Well, they are at a disadvantage in being hired for a full-time faculty position, because in academia, the PhD is often a required skill, a requirement for employment. Well, I'd like to think that my PhD is from the School of Hard Knocks, in that I worked so many years in journalism and did some things in journalism that a lot of people have not done, and accomplished things in journalism that a lot of people have not done. That's where my PhD comes from. And I've been in newsrooms. I've been on a radio station. I've been an administrator, an editor. I've been a reporter. I've been a photographer. I've done all those things. And there's a lot of people in academia that spent minimal amount of time in the real work world of the professional. Just enough to get by, but then they've got that PhD. They got that PhD, so they're Dr. So-and-so. And a lot of them are unprepared to teach diversity because they have not gone out and done it themselves. So we're back to square one. So the minorities are at a disadvantage because they're not recognized and appreciated for their unconventional ways of getting where they are and their successes, as opposed to ones who went the traditional route and got their masters and PhDs in this particular field. And that's still a major fault with higher education. Not just in journalism, but I think across the board.
It's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that it's fascinating to be able to pinpoint that.
Mm-hmm. My career would have been much smoother in academia if I had a PhD. But I was married. I had, we have 3 sons, and when I finished my master's degree, I needed to get a job because my wife was also in college. She was completing her bachelor's degree in microbiology. So I had to work in Yakima because it was close enough to Seattle, and I had to earn an income. And so despite the fact that Roger Simpson encouraged me to go on to pursue my doctorate, I told him I can't. I gotta support my family. I gotta support my wife, who's still in school. She's not working, or she's only working part-time. And so once I got back into the work world and started working and earning a salary as a journalist, I said, I can't go back. I can't put my family through that. And now I'm at the point where I have to start earning enough money to build up a college fund for my sons. So it's about my sons. It's not about me. And what do I need the PhD for when I've worked in this field enough that I have all the skills and experience necessary to teach others how to be a good journalist? A lot of us are in that category. So although I took some doctoral level coursework while at the University of Washington, I didn't complete a PhD degree because I had those other priorities. And if I had it all to do again, I would not change a thing. Even though, as I said, it would be a lot easier. I would have survived and gone through this whole process of academic promotion and tenure if I had those 3 letters at the end of my name, and people could call me Dr. Chavez rather than Mr. Chavez. But I'm very satisfied with Mr. Chavez and what he's done. And I'm not sure I would have been able to do all those things if I had gone back and gotten that PhD. My sons all got their bachelor's degree, and now they all have their master's degree. We're a family of masters. My wife has a master's degree now too in education, and all three of my sons have a master's degree, and I have a master's degree. So we're all masters of our universe. None of us have a PhD, nor do we want one.
Can I ask, just generally, because I'm more or less out of questions, more than less, how do you feel questions of or issues of diversity are considered nowadays in the news media, in the academy?
Yeah. This has always been a process of taking 2 steps forward and then ended up taking 1 step back. Because you're constantly pushing. If you don't keep swimming, I mean, we're constantly swimming against the stream. We're going upstream. And if you stop swimming, stop taking the stream is going to take you down. Okay, it's going to just push you down. So you got to keep fighting the stream. That's the metaphor for what I see in journalism and in academia, is that you constantly have to keep fighting against the stream in order to make progress. And it's hard, it's not easy, but you keep making progress. So for every stroke you take forward, maybe you end up 1 stroke back. Because it's very hard to institute change, especially institutional change in tradition-bound fields like academia. So in the current situation, I think we've kind of eased off on diversity as a priority. I mean, we've elected a black president, so I guess we've achieved diversity. And that seems to be the general feeling, is that, you know, we don't need to push those issues anymore. We've accomplished all these things. And so it's not that big a deal anymore. And the truth is that if we don't keep pushing, then we're going to end up sliding back. And you can see that in our political issues, where they're trying to slide back on the equal voting rights. People are being disenfranchised. They've got all kinds of requirements. You're seeing slide back on immigration issues. And you got to keep pushing those things, because if we don't, we're just going to go back to the way it used to be. And the same thing for diversity. You know, the people are able to say now, well, the reason he got hired was because he's a minority. And the truth is that that person was even more qualified than anybody else who stepped in the door. But now, you know, they want to take that away too. Affirmative action, for example. Affirmative action. Affirmative action was never meant to say, you must hire a minority. Affirmative action was never that. Affirmative action, from the very beginning, good affirmative action programs are the ones that say, you must give an equal opportunity for that individual to secure that position. That's the difference. And a good affirmative action program will take into consideration that person as an individual, their unique background, and their unique set of skills. And it's not about having to hire a minority. It was never about that. And so, you know, you get these ultra-conservatives who don't understand that concept. Because back in the good old days, the good old boys, that's who got hired, is the good old boys hiring other good old boys. And sometimes I see us sliding back to that. News coverage is the same. For different reasons, it's sliding back. Because now we cover things that are easy to cover. Covering diversity is a challenge. It's complex. It's difficult. It's time-consuming. And all we want to do is cover car chases on Los Angeles freeways, where you got a helicopter shooting the video. Action, you know. You know, what led to that particular chase? Was this person so distraught in not being able to provide for his or her family, you know, that they would go out and commit a major crime, that they would rob a convenience store and try to get away. We don't go into that kind of depth, you know. Somebody doesn't rob a store because they're inherently evil. They did it for a reason. What are the underlying reasons? And are those same reasons for that particular community to be disenfranchised? You gotta probe deeper, and we don't do that kind of journalism as much as we used to. So we're sliding back in order to do easy journalism, and that's not our job.
Is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you...
Oh boy, we've covered a lot of area. I'm trying to think. Well, yeah, let me add one thing. I mentioned the awards. In 2001, the Texas Tech University gave me the honor of being selected outstanding alum, outstanding graduate of the journalism program. I think in recognition of all this diversity work. So as part of the award, you were brought back to Lubbock, and they had this awards banquet in which you were presented the award by someone who would provide the background as to why you were getting the award, and then they would, present you this plaque. And what happened was I was presented the award by T.J. Patterson, that business professor that was the publisher of the West Texas Times, who told the gathering as he was talking about me and my background and what I had done and why I deserved this award. And again, I was leery of awards. I was, I'm always kind of uncomfortable because my grandfather was the one who taught me not to get too hung up about awards. He said, don't let the work be its own reward. Don't wait for people to give you prizes. So I've always been uncomfortable receiving awards, but this one was special because T.J. Patterson went up on the stage at the microphone and he gave all this background. He told the story of one particular story that I had done in East Lubbock, in which I had exposed this scam that resulted in a 82-year-old woman to get back her house that had been taken away from her in this housing scam that had been going on. So I did this investigative piece. And he told the story of that, and I remember that particular story, and I remember that this 82-year-old woman was so grateful to me that when I showed up at her house to do the final story, how she had been restored back to her original home. She had been kicked out of the house, literally. And I was there to do the story about her getting back and see how she just, the whole neighborhood had turned out to move her furniture back into her home. So here I am, this little Chicanito, and all these young black men helping this, Nellie Ross was her name. She was kind of the neighborhood grandmother, move all her stuff back in, and then she saw me, and then she just kind of came running up to me as fast as an 82-year-old woman could, and she had reached out her arms and put them around my neck and pulled me down and gave me a big kiss on the cheek and said, "Thank you, son. Thank you for giving me back my home. Thank the Lord, and thank you for giving me back my home." And TJ's told this story, and so everybody got emotional. And here is to receive the award is Ray Chavez. And I stood up and I went up and I got the award, and I hugged T.J. Patterson because he's the one who had provided the means to give Nellie back her home. So it wasn't just that plaque. It was the whole thing. It was the whole experience. It just kind of summarized my career, which started at Texas Tech with the awakening that I knew diversity was important for everyone to not only experience, but to become an agent of change. And TJ was an agent of change, and he had made me an agent of change, and together we had been able to do this for a woman who had unjustly been kicked out of her home. And so that plaque, I have that plaque, and it's not the plaque, but it's the reminder of what led to that plaque and that experience there. So that just about sums it up in terms of diversity and why I'm so passionate and devoted to it.
That's incredible.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much,
Sure.
Mr. Chavez, for taking the time to talk to us.